David Benavidez and Dimitri Andrade, it ain't never going down, y'all. David Benavidez's promoter, Sampson, has been given strict orders from Haymon. You don't ever do business with Dimitri Andrade. And I'm about to let y'all know all about it in this next video. But before we get into it, make sure that y'all hit my like button and subscribe to the channel if you're not already a sub to the channel. What's happening with it, y'all? Now, we just found out that the fight that people been talking about, a big, huge fight for David Benavidez and Dimitri Andrade's first big fight in his 14 years of being a professional fighter, will never, ever happen, y'all. And this is why. So shout out to the Boxing Voice, first of all. Now, Sampson was on the Boxing Voice, and Sampson is David Benavidez's promoter. He was talking about Canelo Alvarez and David Benavidez. And Sampson goes on to say that Canelo Alvarez was actually offered, right? He was offered a fight for David Benavidez. And he said the offer that Canelo Alvarez got to fight David Benavidez was much more than $50 million, right? So by the way he was saying it, he was saying basically it was over $60 million that Canelo Alvarez was offered to fight David Benavidez. Now here's the details from Sampson's mouth. He says that David Benavidez was sent an offer from Haymon. And so how that works is when you sent the offer, Haymon, he sits down David Benavidez and they say, here, if you want to fight Canelo Alvarez, here's the budget. Here's what you can make and here's what he can make out of the overall budget. Well, Sampson is saying that David Benavidez looked at that and he said, you know what? I accept. But here's the thing. I'll even take much less. I'll basically take pennies on the dollar to fight Canelo Alvarez in order for him to make much more than $50 million. That way we could get the fight done, and I want to make it happen. And then Sampson goes on to say, you know what? When it came to Canelo Alvarez, it wasn't about money to David Benavidez. He just wanted to show the people that he can beat Canelo Alvarez and get that name on his resume. So I said, damn, he was willing to take a lowball offer. And so they get into the numbers and they say, well, you know, 7 mil. And Sampson says, no, he was willing to take much less than 7 mil just so Canelo Alvarez can make a whole lot of money and he can get the Canelo Alvarez fight. And I said, damn, that's crazy. If this is true, I said, this is crazy. Because when you hear fighters, the reason why they want to fight Canelo Alvarez, not so much to get his name on their resume, is because they know if they get a Canelo Alvarez fight, it's going to be their biggest payday that they've ever made in their whole entire career. Like a Callum Smith, or Billy Joe Saunders, or Caleb Plant. All of those fighters made the most money they've made in their whole entire career just because they was fighting Canelo Alvarez and the revenue that he brings in, right? So a lot of these fighters, they don't even believe they can beat Canelo Alvarez. They just want to fight him because they know how much money they're going to make fighting Canelo Alvarez. But Sampson, David Benavidez's promoter, says that wasn't the case with David Benavidez. It wasn't about money to him. He says that David Benavidez already makes very good money doing business with Haymon. He already make very good money. So in this fight, he just wanted the name on his resume. He would have damn near fought Canelo Alvarez for free. And I said, damn, that's crazy. So then they go on to ask Sampson. They said, wow, he's willing to basically fight Canelo Alvarez for nothing. Well, what about Dimitri Andrade? They say, you know, David Benavidez has recently found out that Dimitri Andrade is moving up to 168 pounds, and David Benavidez has now been calling out Demetrius Andrade, and he's saying that after the David Lemieux fight, if he can't get a Canelo Alvarez fight, that he would love to fight Demetrius Andrade next. He says that he thinks that'll be a big fight for the fans, and that'll be an excellent fight since Demetrius Andrade can't get nobody else to fight him. He's more than willing to fight Demetrius Andrade. So then Sampson, he starts looking funny in the face. And then he says, oh, David Benavidez says that? No, that's not happening. And so they say, well, what do you mean? That's a big fight for both fighters. And he says, well, maybe that's just the fighter and him talking, but yeah, nah. And so then they get into numbers, right? And Sampson says, yeah, they'll have to pay us a whole lot of money to fight Demetrius Andrade. And so they say, whoa, what do you mean? Explain to us, what do you mean? What do you mean, like $7 million? And they say, oh, no, way much more than that. Then they say, well, Caleb Plant, he got paid $10 million to fight Canelo Alvarez. So what are you saying? And Sampson says, oh, to fight Demetrius Andrade, for us, David Benavidez, right? And I'm his promoter. For David Benavidez to fight Demetrius Andrade, he'll have to get paid much more than $10 million. So they say, well, has David Benavidez ever made $7 million in a fight? And Sampson says no. Then they say, well, he hasn't ever been paid more than $7 million to fight anybody. And he says no, he's never been paid that much. And then they say, so what are you asking for, like $10 million? And then Sampson says, oh no, that's not enough. We need much more than $10 million to fight Demetrius Andrade. So then they say, well, what do you mean? Like, make that make sense. And he says, well, Demetrius Andrade doesn't bring anything to the table for us. And they say, well, what do you mean? He's a former champion at 154 and 160 pounds. Well, they said, well, he don't put asses in the seats. Nobody really knows him. We're going to need, way more than $10 million. And plus, he is a high-risk fight. He's a difficult fight for David Benavidez. So it's a very, very high risk for David Benavidez. And Sampson says, well, David Benavidez might be able to win that fight. But it's not a risk that we're willing to take unless we're paid a whole shit ton of money. And I thought about it. And I said, this man is basically telling everybody that he's pricing himself out. And he's telling everybody that no matter how much they're offered from DAZN, that David Benavidez is not going to take a fight with Demetrius Andrade. And he's telling us that it ain't got nothing to do with David Benavidez. He says, I'm his promoter, right? I'm his promoter. And I do business with Al Haymon. And we come together and we set up David Benavidez's fights. And if we say no, it's not happening. Then I start thinking, and I said, oh, you know what? I know exactly what's going on, right? I know exactly what's going on. See, years ago, Demetrius Andrade, he crossed Al Haymon. He was working with Al Haymon, and Al Haymon had a fight set up between him, Demetrius Andrade, and Jermell Charlo. And Demetrius Andrade, he pulled out of the fight within a week's notice, leaving Jermell Charlo, right, and Al Haymon with no fight. Messing up the bag for Al Haymon and Jermell Charlo, right? Messing up Al Haymon's whole event. And if y'all go back to a recent video I did, I put a clip in there where Andre Berto said out of his own mouth, he says, you know what? If you cross Al Haymon, you pretty much then fucked up. Because you can do business, but Al Haymon will make sure that you'll never be able to do business with one of his fighters again, right? As long as he lives. And see, that's what's going on. See, Sampson works directly with Al Haymon and Showtime, and Al Haymon has given strict orders for anybody that he works with, and he let them know, if Demetrius Andrade's name come up, you do not do any type of business with him, with any fighters that I work with. It's not happening. So now we know why Demetrius Andrade is not able to get a fight with no big names, right? Think about it. Jamal Charlo is with Al Haymon. Jamal Charlo is always making excuses why he'll never fight Demetrius Andrade. And we always wondering, like, why is Jamal Charlo ducking Demetrius Andrade so hard? Well, now we know. It's not Jamal Charlo ducking Demetrius Andrade. Jamal Charlo has been given strict orders from Al Haymon, letting him know that, yeah, you're not doing it, no business with Demetrius Andrade. Just like Sampson and any other promoter that wants to do business with Al Haymon, they've been given strict orders. If it's Demetrius Andrade, we're not doing no business with him. He can't eat over here, ever. He crossed me, and I'll never forget. So Demetrius Andrade will starve because he won't fight any of our fighters. And that's what's going on, y'all. When it comes to a PBC fighter, Demetrius Andrade will never get a fight with no PBC fighter or any fighter that is advised by Al Haymon. And you know what, man? I'm feeling bad for Demetrius Andrade because, yeah, you got to pay for your sins and you got to pay for your horrible business moves, but they shouldn't be doing this and basically freezing this man out for the rest of his career off of one mistake that he made years and years ago. I understand it, but you know what I'm saying? Let up off the dude. You know what I'm saying? Cut the man some slack. Let these fights be made. The fans want to see these fights. You're not only freezing out Demetrius Andrade, you freezing out the fans of great fights that the fans want to see. So that's what's going on, y'all. Right? The reason Sampson said that basically they're going to have to pay him more money than he knows anybody is willing to pay for that fight is because he's been given orders from the motherfucking Godfather himself, Al Haymon, that we're not doing no business with Demetrius Andrade. And everybody that does business with Al Haymon, they know this. And this is why we haven't been able to see Demetrius Andrade get none of these big fights. Now, as far as the Demetrius Andrade and Canelo Alvarez situation, that's a whole different ball game, right? And Sampson actually told you why Canelo is not willing to fight Demetrius Andrade also. Because when he was asked about David Benavidez, and he said Demetrius Andrade is a difficult fight. He got a difficult style for David Benavidez. Well, that answers your question about Canelo Alvarez also. Canelo Alvarez don't want to fight Demetrius Andrade because it's too high of a risk. It is too high of a risk, and his style is too difficult, right? And he can't make $60-50 million fighting Demetrius Andrade because nobody is willing to pay that for Demetrius Andrade.